Proportion is everything, and over the years, as I've made more and more pots, I've come to realise that more often than not, it's this that designates whether I like a piece or not. For instance, this is a bowl I made and fired recently. I don't mind it, but I don't love it. I think the foot is slightly too wide for the shape, and there isn't enough of a difference between the two angles that make up the outside form. I think being able to properly see shape and proportion is a skill that you learn with time and experience. For instance, if I look back at the bowls I was making towards the beginning of the year, where I was just starting to create these very angular forms, they often feel slightly off. Perhaps their feet are too short or too wide, and sometimes the indented section towards the top feels too overbearing. Yet, over time, they've improved, and it takes this trial and error in creating many different iterations to really develop certain shapes, to get them to the point where you're really happy with them. So in this video, I'm going to talk a bit about that process. I'll also be showing you, mainly during the trimming stage, lots of things you actually shouldn't do. In some ways I should call that part of a video how not to trim a bowl. But sometimes as a maker, you're in a bit of a rush and you push things. Now, for somebody with experience, this can be manageable, but if I was a beginner trimming the pot I'll be turning later, I'm practically certain that person would destroy the piece instead. Anyhow, I'm preparing this piece of clay by spiral wedging it. This essentially moves the clay around in a circle, whilst simultaneously pressing some of it into a spiral that gets smaller and smaller beneath your hands, stretching any pockets of air and popping them, whilst also fully blending the clay body, mixing any hard or soft patches together to create an entirely uniform piece of clay. This step is sort of like setting the foundations, and if it's done poorly, well, you're just going to have more difficulty throwing. Another thing I'll do, especially with larger lumps, is just round the bottom further. I do this by pressing it against the tabletop and rotating it in place. This creates a concave shape on the bottom of the lump, and it means that when I slam it against the wheel head, there's no way it can trap air underneath it. This piece of clay is a touch on the firm side, which is useful for the shape I'm going to be making, which I hope is an improved version of the bowl I showed you at the start. I think in order for it to work, the shape has to be taller and the foot at the leather hard stage has to be narrower. I spin the wheel and tap the piece of clay to get this piece mostly centred initially, and as the clay is on the harder side, I clasp my hands together and run them up the outside of the lump of clay, scraping away clay where it spins around the most off centre. I can add this material back onto the top, but it works surprisingly well to neaten up the initial lump before the proper centering begins. I then cover the lump of clay with water, and I'm going to begin the centering by pressing in at the bottom, as I want to force as much clay up from the bottom as I can into a cone shape. For this movement, I'm pressing in harshly with my left hand, whilst initially my right hand is sort of just helping to guide the clay upward, but it really is this left hand that's pressing in harshly. Then, as the cone of clay gets taller, I'm almost pulling in with my right hand to counter the forward pressure of my left. And then I use both hands together to gently work the piece of clay downward. For a shape like the bowl I'm making, before I begin forming the actual piece, this lump of clay has to be a tall, wide puck shape with a flat top and flat sides. But typically, especially with a piece of clay of this size, I'll cone the lump of clay 2 or 3 times. This will ensure that everything inside is fully blended, as even if you've spent a lot of time wedging the lump of clay prior to getting on the wheel, you'll often be able to feel small inconsistencies within the spinning mass, and this coning technique really helps to deal with them. The next step is to open up the piece of clay, and as I want this bowl to have a very tall foot, I'm only going to be pressing down about halfway. As I press my fingers in, I also use the crook of my thumb to scrape away any subtle undulations that appear in the mass of clay. And with this slip that covers my hands, I try to coat this back onto the piece of clay and throw with that. Although when opening up like this, don't be afraid of using a touch too much water, as the amount of force needed to open up the lump like this will very quickly turn water to slip, and then that dries out too. And it's when your hands become dry and the clay is still spinning that things can very quickly go wrong, as ideally through 90% of the throwing process, you want your hands and the clay you're manipulating to glide together. You don't want your hands to stick to the piece of clay as it turns, as it draws it off-centre and creates severe undulations. Despite this shape ultimately being a wide bowl, the first thing I'm going to do is collar the clay up into a cylinder, as I need height so I can then stretch that out, converting it into width. This can be a somewhat easier way of creating bowls, rather than initially throwing them into their wide shape straight away. And before I begin the real lifting and shaping, I spend a moment tightly clasping the rim, centering it, essentially, because as this thick rim is pulled and stretched outward, any slight distortion in it will become exaggerated, but I still need to gain height before I can widen the bowl. And to do this, I simply press in around the base very firmly, essentially creating a narrower bottom. This forces that material up into the wall, which I can then lift up. And I think this is probably the hardest part about learning how to throw with larger lumps of clay. It's much easier to squeeze and move the clay around when the walls are thinner. But the changes you have to make aren't huge. You simply have to use more surface area, both with your hand on the outside pushing in, and on the hand inside lifting up. You also have to be prepared to work more slowly, as lifting the clay up from bottom to top isn't something you do in mere seconds. Instead, it can take 20 to 30 seconds to travel the entire way, with the key being even, smooth, consistent movement. If you stay in one place for too long or suddenly move your hands much faster, you'll create an inconsistent section in the wall, and thus the wheel speed, the rate at which you move your hands, and the pressure applied should remain as consistent as possible for a majority of the pull. Although as I reach the very top, I don't squeeze and press through the rim, thinning it. I instead release my grip early. This way I can retain thickness in the rim, which I'm going to need to form that indented section you saw on the pots earlier. It's funny, as if I was throwing a pot that didn't have such a thick base, I'd be able to get much more height out of it, but a good chunk of the bottom portion of this form is solid, as it's that part that will make up the foot ring later. Now, the next step is to begin widening this shape, which I'm going to do very slowly and gradually by pressing the walls out against a plastic kidney. I'm not going to press the form out in one go to its lowest shape. Instead, it's something I'll do gradually, stretching the walls out bit by bit until it's the shallow shape I want. Now, the other crucial thing to do before this pot gets too wide is press a rough indentation around the rim. It doesn't have to be perfect at this point, so I just create an approximate groove. This way, as the pot is stretched out further, this indent remains. I do it at this point as it would be much more difficult to impart later, when the pot is wider. As I shape, I regularly check and compress the rim just to make sure it's kept under control. You can see in this sped up footage how the rim becomes slightly off center at times. This typically occurs as I'm stretching the walls out, but it's corrected thereafter, which I can do as I did purposefully leave the rim to be relatively thick. This way there's simply some material to work with. I then spent about 4 or 5 minutes blasting the outside shape as I started to refine the interior curve. This just stiffened the clay, and it meant I could push it out without worrying about the form widening any further. If you're using soft clay, there's quite a high chance that the form could begin to slump, and this is something at this stage that can be quite difficult to correct, especially with the indent set around the rim. To properly define this indent, I press a metal kidney into it to create 2 distinct planes, as opposed to a less defined curve. And at this point, I don't mind if the clay here is a touch on the thick side, as I'd much rather thin it out at the leather hard stage, when the clay is more forgiving and less likely to be distorted or collapse. And the next step is to tidy up the rather messy bottom. Yes, there is potentially some more clay here that I could have pressed up and used to throw with, but it's too late for that now, so instead I'm just going to carefully scrape it away, never allowing too much to build up on the tool, as otherwise it can form a gathered lump that then presses into the walls above it, distorting the shape of the bowl. Simply put, trim away a little at a time rather than a lot. I then use a serrated wire to slice the bowl off the wheel, and then, as there's so much excess clay in the base, I can simply prod my fingers into it to lift the piece off neatly without distorting it too much. And notice how I spin the wheel at the exact moment I lift. This helps to break the slightly sticky seal there might be, separating it cleanly. I'm going to let this piece dry out overnight beneath plastic, which I'll sling over these kiln props so the plastic doesn't actually touch the pot, as if it did, obviously the part that makes contact won't dry out as much, and then when it comes time to remove it, if I forget there's contact and I drag the plastic off, it can yank the bowl in a certain direction, distorting it. It's now the following day, and in truth I should have left the bowl uncovered overnight, as it's in that sort of borderland where it's still quite soft, yet just about turning leather hard. The issue is I have to trim the pot this morning. I suppose I could properly wrap it and leave it for more than a week, but I'd rather deal with it now. This means I'm going to have to thoroughly force dry it, a process that if not done carefully can cause cracks to form throughout the pot or severely distort it. It's for that reason, in fact, I keep the pot spinning quickly the entire time. Now, if you look at the rim carefully, you'll notice that it is undulating a touch. It's kicking in one direction, and so to fix that, I hold a plastic kidney really firmly and gently force it into the rim to brace it. By holding the hard plastic kidney steady, the still relatively soft clay has to conform to it. Thus, that slight touch of movement found in the rim is removed. Remember how I said I left the rim to be slightly on the thick side? Well, now is the moment that I carve it back to be much thinner. I hold the turning tool extremely carefully with 2 hands to make sure it stays steady as I trim this flared section to be straighter and finer. Of course, turning this part of the pot has left the rim looking rather ragged, so before I can move on to properly tidying up the interior, I first just compress the rim and burnish it. I do this with a plastic kidney initially, then I run a dense damp sponge over this as it creates a beautifully smooth surface the glaze will sit neatly on. At the same time, I don't want to do this too much, as it quickly grinds away the clay, leaving a rough surface that has much more grog present. I noticed at this point a slight chattering in the rim, and so to fix this I just hold a sharp metal scraper against it, the edge of which is actually coming nowhere near the rim itself. It's the part just below that I'm fixing. I then spend a few moments running a curved kidney up and down the interior surface. I want to make this curve as perfect as it can be, as the whole point of these pots is that they have a beautifully curved interior and an angular exterior, thus giving me the best of both worlds. And again, the last thing I do for the inside is just run this damp, dense sponge over it. This creates a flush surface with less pockmarks, which should mean, ultimately, that when I glaze it, the glaze will settle in a neater layer on this surface, with less bubbles and craters. And it's now that I can move on to the more exciting trimming, the refining of the outside shape to create the bowl's more distinctive angular form. I begin with the indent at the top. This does various things for the pot. It creates an area that's quite nice to hold once fired, as your fingers slot into the groove. As a finished object, the 2 planes also catch the light differently, helping to break up what could otherwise be quite a uniform surface. And lastly, it creates an area the glaze can pool into nicely. It was at this point I realised the pot wasn't actually attached down properly to the wheel head, so I took it off and brushed a band of slip just beneath it. You don't want to cover the entire bottom with slip, as otherwise it can be very difficult to remove. You can see that the plane just beneath the rim is wavering as it spins. And to fix this, I'm basically going to trim it very gradually, turning away the part that spins out the furthest, reverting the walls back into a more circular shape. This requires initially holding the tool very steady, as I only want it to turn away clay from a certain point. Then I slowly begin to work it down the wall, holding the blade steady, again so it only turns away from the furthest point. This essentially gets rid of the undulation that's in the wall. But as I turn this piece I am having to be careful, as after having torched the outside shape, it creates a layer on the outside that's much harder than the clay that you reveal on the inside. This means I'm having to adjust the amount of pressure I'm using when I push the blade against the bowl. With the shape now spinning true, I can turn this portion of the wall to be straighter, and if you're watching this and you haven't seen me make one of these shapes before, during the throwing stage the walls are left purposefully thick. This way they can be turned to have an angular shape whilst retaining the curved shape on the inside. I then do the same thing when I begin trimming the lower plane on this bowl, and notice how I'm using a very small point of contact, as this way I can press it very harshly into the clay and still remove a lot of material whilst retaining control. Whereas on the other hand, if I was trying to use the entire expanse of the blade, I wouldn't be able to remove quite as much material, and, perhaps more importantly, I'd actually have less control. This is something I keep in mind whenever I'm turning and removing lots of mass. I begin with just a small portion of the blade and I trim aggressively. Then, when it's more about shaping as opposed to just removing clay, I can switch to using the entire expanse of the blade, as it's easier to turn flat surfaces that way. By the way, I've trimmed the pot this way up, which is perhaps a bit unconventional, as it allows me to feel the cross-section of the walls as I'm turning. But with it this way up, I obviously can't turn the inside of the foot. So after a certain point, when the walls are feeling nice and even, I'll flip the pot upside down delicately onto its rim. This exposes the base and it means I can trim the foot. A pot that's this wide and still relatively weighty holds itself onto the wheel very well. You'll see that some people attach pots this way up with water on the rim, much like I did with the base, but I prefer not to, as it means I'd have to spend more time later cleaning the rim again, essentially creating more work for myself. I know that I trim pots rather a lot and it becomes quite an arduous process, therefore I do try to streamline it if I can. Trimming this part of the foot was very difficult, as like I mentioned earlier, the clay on the outside was quite hard, yet the clay on the inside of the foot here is much softer. As compared to the walls, this part is just so much thicker, which means I'm going to have to be a lot more careful about how I turn it, as two things happen when you're trimming soft clay. The first is that you may accidentally pierce a hole in the pot with far less force, and the other issue is that the form itself can distort as you trim it. The foot of this pot is sort of in that state, meaning that if I were to press too hard or lose control, I could very easily damage the foot irreparably. Before I begin hollowing out the foot though, you can see that this surface is quite scratchy and rough. So to remedy this, I scrape it over first to make sure it's flat, then I wet and compress it with a damp, dense sponge, before burnishing over this surface with a plastic kidney. These 3 steps create a much smoother surface. The last step of trimming bowls like this is turning the foot. I'll always begin by beveling the outside edge, as this creates a point of contact that's less likely to chip with use, whilst also creating a very clear boundary as where I have to apply the glaze to. Hollowing this out was a challenge as the clay was so sticky. It meant that I had to keep the trimming tool under a lot more tension, so I braced the blade portion with 2 additional fingers just to keep it from potentially sticking and being dragged around by the soft clay. If I had more time, I would simply stop trimming, set the pot aside, wrap plastic around the body, and then leave the piece exposed overnight. The interesting thing is that I'll know that I'm trimming close to the floor of the pot as the clay will begin to stiffen up again as I approach the other side. But for the time being, I'm just going to remove clay bit by bit, as with sticky clay, if I try to trim away too much at once, all the stoneware can accumulate on the blade's edge and then slam into the side of the foot ring, potentially distorting it or simply smearing clay all over it. The typical rule I tend to follow is that if the clay sticks to the turning tool's blade, then it's still too soft to trim. After each layer is turned away inside the foot, I press down very gently with my thumb. I'm looking to see if the base bows inward slightly, indicating that I've trimmed far enough. Yet at the same time, with clay this soft, it can be a bit deceptive, as you can press and indent the clay, yet this might not be an indicator that the base is actually thin enough, and this may result in a crack forming in the bottom as you leave the floor of the pot much thicker than the surrounding walls. And here's an example of that. You can see how the crack travels all the way through the bottom, even appearing on the interior surface. This has nothing to do with compression, which is something that is often blamed on. In fact, it's simply because the inside of the foot was this thick and the walls on the outside were practically half that thickness. This sort of difference in cross-section can often lead to cracks like this forming, so I try my best to make them as equal as possible. With the depth achieved, the next step is thinning out the foot ring, and when turning this, there is something I'm considering. I want its shape to be as even as it can be, without any thick or thin spots, as inconsistencies here can lead to the foot warping when fired. As I want a straight surface, I'm using a tool with a straight blade, and once again, I'm never trying to do too much in one go, as it's so easy to make a mistake here, and trim away more than you'd like. With the foot nearing completion, I just run the sponge over the interior walls to smooth the surfaces, and I compress the facets on the bottom of the foot to burnish them, smooth them, and just neaten them up. It was at this point that I noticed that the inside of the foot was deeper than the walls on the outside. This means, provided you've thrown the pot accurately, the outside wall can be trimmed back to match it, as the internal floor of the foot should be the same level as the walls on the outside of the foot ring. And if they aren't, it means there's some sort of disparity in the object you're making, and it's therefore likely heavier than it should be. The foot ring is then stamped with my maker's mark, and I transfer it onto a larger bat so that I can place another one on the foot, and then I can flip the object between them. With pots like this that are still relatively soft and they're wide and thinly trimmed, it's just safer to flip them like this, as you're less likely to bend the piece or press the walls inward as you try to hold it and flip it. And here's the finished angular bowl. I much prefer its shape as compared to the smaller version, where as the angular change in the walls is so subtle, you can barely notice it once glazed. Whereas on this piece you'll definitely notice it. The smaller foot ring works too in its favour, as it creates a more elegant shape. And despite there of course being a size difference between these two, the shape on the left is much more what I had in mind when I initially threw the piece on the right. I know a narrower, taller foot obviously makes the pot more susceptible to tipping over, but truthfully, I'm not really making these pots with function being the leading choice in how they're designed aesthetically. I think in many ways I'm well past that. With many of these pieces, I'm beginning to see them as sculptural forms as compared to being entirely utilitarian. The final and very important thing for this bowl, as it is still so wet, is to dry it immensely slowly. So I've wrapped in plastic, both above and below, and I'll leave it like this so all the clay can acclimatise to each other and become the same firmness. And that's it for the time being. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. By the way, I'm updating my online shop on November the 23rd at 7 PM GMT, but you can find out much more information about that over on my Instagram account. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and as always, I'll see you next time.